Joining us this evening is Professor Richard Shaw. Professor Shaw is from Massey University and teaches comparative and New Zealand politics with a particular focus on elections and electoral systems. You must be in big demand at the moment, Richard, for your time, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's that stage in the 3 yearly cycle back where people taking it, well, not you clearly, but other people take an interest in elections and electoral systems, and there's plenty to get stuck into, that's for sure.
Yeah, so thank you for giving us a little bit of time today. I want to bring up the conversation that we're going to have, and that is based around the article you have written and has been posted in the conversation. I think it actually went in there today, indeed. So hot off the press, Richard, we're hot off the press. Where you state after the election, now this is, I guess, assuming, I think you do say in the article whether they win or not, but after the election, Christopher Luxon's real test could come from his right, not the left. And of course, when we think about his right, we're thinking about ACT. I'd say maybe we're thinking about New Zealand First. I think their rhetoric at the moment feels like it's coming from the further right, but I think where they naturally sit is more centrist. It feels like they may be going after some votes by being controversial as opposed to actually genuinely sitting on the further right. But at the moment, the way they're all talking, further right to national would be ACT and New Zealand First. And I guess some of those minor parties who chances are aren't going to be there. So do you want to explain to us what you mean that Christopher Luxon's real test could come from his right post-election?
Sure. I think that there is something that is occurring on the right generally of New Zealand politics. And that something has to do with the way in which ACT has built over a little while now an electoral coalition on the right. Mm-hmm. And it largely comprises disaffected farmers, not all farmers clearly, but there is a lobby within the farming community, which I think is showing signs of frustration or disaffection with the National Party.
Pushed by Groundswell? Do you think Groundswell is the kind of pushing point for that?
I don't know if Groundswell is a pushing point, but it's certainly a vehicle for the expression of that kind of view. I think that part of that goes a long way back to the revolution of the 80s and 90s, the liberalisation of farming markets and commodity markets and so on.
For sure.
But there is also something kind of cultural going on around the natural dominance of the stories about this country and who comprises the backbone of the nation and so on and so forth, which I think is challenging farmers' positions. So, and I drove up to Taranaki over the weekend. You see ACT Party billboards all the way up the south coast of Taranaki. So there's something
big war chest, eh? They've got a big war chest for all that.
Seriously big war chest, certainly compared to parties on the left and the centre left. So it seems to me, I don't have the data yet. We'll see what happens during the election, but it seems as if there's a component of that vote there amongst the agricultural sector, which is peeling away from national and heading across to ACT. And you bring that together with the sort of the natural constituency of ACT, which is low tax loving urban liberals. And I think both of those groups they are people to whom National might historically have thought were their people, and now they're not people. Now they look as if they might be going somewhere else. Look, I don't know, National or the ACT Party have been hovering around 10, 11, 12, 14, 15% by some polls for a while now. They dropped back in the one that came out this morning. I haven't seen the tonight's poll, but but ACT are holding up really well. And so it seems that there is some realignment that might be going on the right of the National Party, which, irrespective of what happens at the election, the National Party under Christopher Luxon might need to get its head around.
When you say that his test could come from the right, Christopher Luxon's test could come from the right post-election, we have Simon Wilson on from the New Zealand Herald a fair bit, and he wrote an article maybe 2 months ago that said, there's a possibility that ACT could be the biggest party on the right at the following election. I guess that's kind of what you're saying as well. Like, you're not saying that, but if his issue is going to come from the right, it sounds like we're also saying the further right could overtake National to be the dominant party.
Well, you look at if by the further right, if there is a space to the right of National Party which comprises people who are presently indicating support for New Zealand First, the ACT Party, the various fringe parties that have been set up by former MPs and various conspiracy theorists and so on. Yep. That's not an insignificant vote. It's reasonably fragmented and a little bit chaotic at the moment. But if it were to cohere around some, that is kind of natural ACT Party territory in a sense. So I think Wilson is right. I don't think this election is. I mean, this election is important because if Luxon and the National Party have to rely upon Seymour, who stands his ground and he's only prepared to offer support on confidence, and every other thing has to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. That is a very, very difficult administration for Luxon to administer on a day-to-day basis. But I think Wilson's right. I think the longer-term challenge to the natural place of the National Party and the stories we tell ourselves about centre-right conservative politics in Aotearoa New Zealand, they come at the next election. They come in 26 and in 29.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, how much of this has got to do with, my words, not yours, but Luxon's unlikability? I mean, you write in your article, Luxon is still lacks political definition in a way. John Key, former National Party leader and Prime Minister, whose political success it is Luxon's job to reprise. The two things that most people knew about John Key were that he was born in a state house and grew up to become an international man of finance. Luxon hasn't got his story across. He's not quite as, touch point like John Key was. How much of the movement towards ACT do you think is to do specifically with the leader of National versus a general drift? I mean, if you have a look into it in the US, the general drift to the right, Trumpian. I mean, Trump is now the major voice on the right in America, and his supporters seems to be driving all politics. So is it about the current National Party and its leadership, or is it a trend in politics that's giving that further right, the space to the right of National, more of a more impact at the moment and forthcoming?
I think it's the second of those 2 points, Pat. I don't think much of this has to do with Christopher Luxon at all. It predates him, and the deeper sort of structural realignments that are going on, particularly in the farming community, they occurred long before Christopher Luxon became leader of the National Party. So I don't think that he has much to do with this. I know there's a bit of a tendency at the moment to use the language of presidential elections in the context of what's going on here. I don't think that's necessarily all that helpful either, because we don't live in a republic. We're not a presidential system. We're a parliamentary system. And sure, the leaders really matter because we have this intense personalisation, but not necessarily the presidentialisation of parliamentary politics. So, it's easy for us to look at Luxon or Hipkins or Seymour and whomever, and we do that just because those guys, they are all guys, aren't they? They're just shorthand. They're political shorthand. They give us a really quick and easy way of making sense of their parties. But I think if Wilson is right, and if there is some kind of realignment going on, if what I'm suggesting turns out to be the case, and it's really speculative at the moment, this doesn't have a whole lot to do with Luxon, other than in the way in which the National Party respond strategically to this, if it does become a thing.
As an academic, do you kind of comment on good or bad, or do you just see the trends and analyze them? So, like, if the New Zealand right went further right, and I think, again, not to compare it directly to America, but that's what you're seeing is when certain politicians on the right have realized that Trumpian language and demeanor is working, they've taken it on board, it would appear, to get the vote. Do you think, say, ACT was the bigger party in the following election, that would be good for New Zealand, bad for New Zealand, or as an academic, do you just observe what's happening and comment on it?
That's a really good question. I think my role as an academic is to observe, comment, offer ways of making sense of those sorts of developments and trends, try and bring something to a conversation that maybe would not otherwise have been there. I have to be really careful, I think, in most contexts, not to take a normative position. There are a couple of reasons why that's the case, and the most obvious one is that if I pin my partisan politics on a wall behind me, then that quite reasonably calls into question in many people's minds my capacity to offer anything like a reasonably impartial, partisan, non-partisan interpretation of things. So I need to be a little bit careful about that.
Do you think, although we're talking about the gap to the right of National, that the current embodiment of National, again, in America, they say, this is not Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. This is not the Republican Party of your granddad. This is very different. Your article says one journalist suggested a national victory would produce an unruly rump of zealots championing Christian identity politics and pose, quote, a significant risk to National's cohesiveness and its ability to hold that power. Do you think where National Party sits today is not the National Party of Bill English and John Key, and it is further to the right?
I think if you look at their standard position on those defining issues, tax, the role of the market, the relationship between the state and the private sector, then it's clearly the National Party. But I think if you look at the biographies and the personal preferences of a number of the people who are presently in the National Party's caucus, and some of those who would come in if National poll in the low 40s in the coming election, then they will bring with them views which are not necessarily views that have been held in large kind of concentrations in that caucus. I mean, I don't think that's not necessarily an issue until it becomes an issue because they start to inform the policy positions that the National Party take. We've got a really long tradition in this country of essentially having a secular parliament. One of the very first things that happened when the very first parliament sat in Auckland at Tamaki Makaurau in 1854 was there was a parliamentary debate about getting a man of the cloth in on the floor of the House to offer a prayer. And the parliamentarians, all of whom would have been religious men at the time, said, no, we're not having that.
Yeah.
So we didn't have the religious presence. We still have prayer, and there was kind of arguments around that. But we do have this reasonably strict conventional distinction between state and religion. We're not a theocracy. So it isn't an issue, I think, if it remains a private concern. But then you get another really interesting question as well. To what extent can you become a policymaker in the New Zealand Parliament or the executive branch and keep your private concerns out of it? I think that article by Andrea Vance was really interesting. I think the one written by Matthew Hooton from memory, North and South, maybe a year or two ago, uses much, much, much firmer language. Hooton talks about the Taliban within the National Party. There has long been a tension within the National Party between the sort of the urban conservatives, what the Tories in the UK would call One Nation Tories, One Nation National Party people, and people who are more religiously and morally or ethically conservative. And I think the balance has probably swung towards the second of those groups. And
Right.
in the present climate of the nature of politics, contemporary politics, those people are less inclined to sit on their views and more inclined to bring them into the public domain. And that becomes an issue, I think, absolutely.
Well, I think that's actually the tenet of the kind of Christian faith, is that you have an outworking of it. And this is one of the things that's been so confusing to me as someone who was involved with the church for a long time, is that how can you say that you think abortion is akin to murder, but then go, but I'm going to do nothing about it? If I'm in a position to make a difference to the murder stats, I'm going to do nothing about it because that's my personal belief. Or how can you adhere to this kind of faith? We talked about this last week, that looks after the widows and orphans, but you say, if you're a troublemaking Kaingoora house, we're going to kick you out. Where are you going to go? I don't know. Going to kick you out, though. It just those things seem incongruent to me, and I'm wondering how much of that Christian influence will be had versus how much. I mean, like, I would rather have someone show empathy and mercy towards people who are most vulnerable, but it seems that from what he voiced in the weekend on Q&A, he's like, you'll be gone no matter what. It's trying to figure all that out and how much that actual Christian, quote unquote Christian influence would have in this party who is has a more of a theocratic look on the world than perhaps the National Party of 20 years ago.
It's looking a little bit doctrinaire, isn't it? I think there is Christianity. You can't use the definitive article. You can't talk about the Christian position, or you can talk about a Christian position. It's not to mix my metaphors, but I'm about to. It's a broad church. You have people like Michael Joseph Savage who talked about his version of Labour Party politics as applied Christianity. If you looked at the liberation theologians who came out of Central America in the 80s and 90s, who were radical leftists, but who had a very doctrinally based interpretation or doctrinally based case for social justice. Those are Christians. You have an awful lot of Christian people in this country who would absolutely not identify with positions that are taken by some within the National and other parties who identify as Christian. So there are plenty contemporary debates within Christianity, I think. So I need to be mindful of those. But I think what you're getting to, Pat, is a really important question about the extent to which somebody whose life is so strongly structured by Christianity is able to keep all that stuff at the door of the chamber when they walk in. I'm not sure that that's possible.
Yeah, and also last question, I guess, and it's really back to your article where you're talking about, that Christopher Luxon, if people are just joining us, Christopher Luxon, and I'll read the exact article heading, after the election, Christopher Luxon's real test could come from his right, not from the left. Quite towards the end of the article, in fact, the last kind of paragraphs you read, such difficulties would be partly of National's own making. You go on to explain that, but basically, National gave ACT and David Seymour a path to Parliament 3, 4, 5, 6 elections in a row, it's almost like, what's that saying about the monster you've created eating you? Whatever that saying is. But it's like if they hadn't have been for National Giving Act Air, they wouldn't likely be there today to be this force that may end up eating its creator. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, when ACT was created, Sir Roger Douglas, Richard Prebble, Rita Richardson, I think, top of my head, for the first 3 MMP elections, 96, 99, 2002, they averaged around about 7 to 10%, and then they essentially disappeared. And since 2002, there's been one election, which was the one in 2020, at which the party has cleared the 5% threshold. They're only there by virtue of deals that have been struck between John Key and various leaders of the ACT party. So, that part of the article is just raising a question which is really for the National Party, depending on what happens on the big day this time round, and whether or not they do have to deal with a kind of a challenging, feisty David Seymour, who holds them over various constitutional barrels in order to maximise his leverage. The fact that might take place is a consequence, in part, of choices which previous national parties have made in quite different political times. So that one may well come back to haunt them.
It also shows how the left doesn't do politics very well, because the left in Epsom could also have gotten David Seymour out, because if you have a look at the number of people who voted for the Greens and for the Labour Party candidate, if they all had voted, for example, for Goldsmith, then there was enough votes there to get Goldsmith above David Seymour. So it speaks to me also of how the right seem to, shall I say always? I'll say always play politics a bit better than the left, because the left could have done something about that 2, 3, 4 elections ago, and they didn't. And of course, then the left hasn't had any handshakes with people who could have helped them as well. Raf Manji's a good example in Ilam at the moment. Now, I don't think Raf is actually necessarily there to help the left. I think he's more of a centrist, but the left seems to have ardently refused to do cup of tea handshakes when it may have helped them. The left voter seems to have ardently not been able to get around, for example, voting for Goldsmith and Epsom to get rid of ACT. And the right's like, here's the handshake, here's the keys to the kingdom. And now, as I say once again, the creation might end up eating the creator.
There's another, yes, and there is another way of looking at this as well. I think Verity Johnson from Stuff published something a week or two ago, which was an op-ed based on a series of conversations, anecdotal exchanges she'd had with people who she identified as centre-left people who were a little disaffected, a little disenchanted with Hipkins, and were not going to vote.
Yes.
My sense is that turnout will probably be lower across the board this time round for a bunch of reasons. But I think if that does, there's a bunch of assumptions here. If that does occur, and if turnout falls, and at least a part of that fall is explained by centre-left voters who are just sort of pissed off and get sulky and walk away and have an election off, that'll be another example of the kind of phenomenon that you're referring to. That'll be, some people can indulge themselves in that particular way. I think there are others who are going to experience material changes to their lives as a consequence of a change of government. And perhaps they don't have the luxury of deciding just to walk away from an election.
Yep, and I firmly believe, and from research internationally, that if every single person in a population voted, most Western civilization populations, if not all, lean to the left, but the left are more easily turned away from the vote, and the right seem to be better at getting around to vote, and that seems to be what keeps it a lot closer than it could be from time to time.
Yeah, and I think really broad terms, the left is probably inclined to take more doctrinaire positions and a little less inclined just to step back and engage in pragmatic politics.
Yeah. Professor Richard Shaw from Massey University, if you want to read the article that we are referencing right now, then just head to theconversation.com. I think you can just look up .co.nz as well, mind you. But if you can't find it, if you struggle to find it, just look up Richard Shaw and you'll get all 40 of the articles that he's written there. After the election, Christopher Luxon's real test could come from his right, not from the left. Richard, thanks so much for joining us today, especially, I'm sure, because you've got a million things to do and every media outlet in the country wants to talk to you. So I appreciate you giving us some time.
Cheers, Pat. Appreciate it.